Thanks, Mike. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. So we've got the dreaded cleanup spot here. So what I would say is let's just everybody stand up for one couple 30 seconds. Yeah, it feels really good to stand up, stretch out. You have permission. We got only 30 minutes more to go. Yeah, shake out those legs. Okay, we're going to have a little talk about lifelong learning, but you can't learn unless you're, I learned that from coaching. They cannot possibly follow instructions unless they're actually awake and paying attention. So, okay, you got 10 seconds till you got to sit down, stretch it out, shake it out. You do a little stretching, maybe find your center. I always find with my kids, you can just kind of find your center. That helps. All right, thank you very much. All right, now we're ready to go. We're here today to talk about lifelong learning. Most of this conference, of course, is talking about classroom K-12, higher education. There's a whole piece of the industry that really lives more in the consumer world, either lives in the high-tech world or consumer websites or media, and of course in the news media that is actually providing a pretty critical role in learning. But yet it's often not included in the conversation. So we're really thrilled here at Curious to be hosting several conversations throughout the summit. We have Carol Dweck at 3 o'clock. I really would strongly encourage you to join us for that conversation because the growth mindset is pervading everything that's happening these days in education. I've probably heard it mentioned 50 times, including Saul just mentioned it. And it certainly is the reason why we started Curious. And so today we're going to talk with Alisa and with Mike about the news media and the role that the news media plays in education and learning throughout life. And then we also are out on the Coronado patio all during the summit recording conversations that are being broadcast live to the Curious Nation and being recorded in our library with all kinds of fascinating people talking about learning and their own curious journeys. So we encourage you to also join us for those things. But today, our topic at hand is going to be specifically news to knowledge and what role does the news media play. We've got two really interesting perspectives here. We have Alisa Miller, who is the CEO of Public Radio International. I'm a huge public radio junkie, as I'm sure many people in this room are. And the public radio is a large source. Thank you, yes. Let's give a round of applause. Public radio is carrying the torch for many people in the role of lifelong learning. It provides an awful lot of the sort of wedged learning that happens throughout your day. And then another organization that plays a big part of that role is sitting right next to Alisa, and that would be Mike with Flipboard. Mike, welcome. And also, if you think about how people use Flipboard, it's about wedging learning in throughout your day. So we've decided to throw that three of us together into the hopper and see what comes out. And I've asked them to start just by explaining what they think their organization is responsible for, what role they do actually play in learning, and how important that is to their everyday work that they do. So Mike, why don't you start?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. The themes that people have been talking about deeply resonate with me personally. When I was in high school, freshman, there was absolutely no hope that I was going to college. I was not a good student at all. I was the oldest of 6 kids. My dad was dying of cancer. My mom was distracted with keeping track of running a small ad business that my dad and my mom had built over the years that was struggling as a result. And so I really could have gone either way in high school, and I could have ended up on the outside of the pyramid that Saul talked about, and it was a tough time. And the only thing that really I was interested at all in high school was the fact that we had a computer lab, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a computer. And I remember going into the computer lab. You couldn't take any computer courses until you were a senior. So I was a freshman, so it was a long ways off. But you could at least after school use the computers. And I had no idea what I was doing. And I sat in front of the computer and I typed, "Can you talk?" And I hit enter. And it just said syntax error. I'm like, OK, how do you use these things? And because there were no courses, there was, interestingly enough, a magazine called 99er Magazine. These were TI 99 4A computers, for those of you who remember back then, 1981. And these computers, and this magazine was written all about these computers, and they would feature programs that people would write and submit, and you could see all the source code. And then there would be an article about how the program was created. And so I just became a huge, avid reader of these magazines. There was another magazine called Creative Computing Magazine, and I would read these and learn about programming, and then I would write programs. And I learned about what it was like to be an entrepreneur, because a lot of the kinds of things you started to see were things that were happening with Steve Jobs and Apple and Bill Gates, and a lot of the entrepreneurial things that were happening in Silicon Valley. I was in upstate New York. And so I really started to get inspired to program, learned how to program, taught myself, got inspired about building a business, started to think about making my own video game that I could one day submit to one of these magazines. After a few years of working at it, I was finally able to get a video game published. Got $50 for it.
Very good. Time, that was pretty good.
Exactly. And I went from there. And my whole future was shaped by what I read, these stories that I read in these magazines that taught me, that inspired me, and made me the person I am today. And so for what I'm doing with Flipboard is really about creating an environment where those kinds of great stories can really be discovered by people who will, when they see them, it will change their life. It will move them forward as a student, as a professional, as a political leader, as a teacher. And so that's why we're building Flipboard. And we've built it now over about 6 years, about 85 million people around the world who use it. And they use it to collect great stories, package those stories up about the things that they're really passionate about. On Flipboard, you follow your interests. And then what you see are things that people are sharing and curating about those interests. And it's a wonderful experience. It's modeled after a magazine. I grew up on magazines. It's beautiful. You use it on an iPhone or tablet. It's very interactive, feels just like a magazine, but that's made for you, curated by people who share your passions, who share your enthusiasm for what you're interested in. So that's what we're building, and it's all about lifelong learning. It's about inspiring people with these great stories, and it's been an amazing journey.
Fantastic. And Alisa, do you have a story to share with us too, sort of about how you found yourself at public radio, and even before that, the passion that you found for this medium that you are working in?
Well, it's really interesting. There's some similarities in some of our stories, and I think when we all find our passion, oftentimes it's that seed when we're young, and so the earlier discussion is so important to that. So I've always been very interested in media and technology and storytelling. I actually learned how to read my first word from watching Sesame Street. It was the word "it," by the way. And I remember that moment of the storytelling and having that interaction in my life and how important that was to me. So when an Apple IIe computer showed up at our house, I was really curious about it and started to try to figure out how to make the light dash across the screen and taught myself a little bit of programming. So I was sort of a girl interested in STEM before we talked about even what that was. I didn't know people who programmed. I didn't know people who did that. I thought people who are engineers worked on cars. I had no idea that there was this whole other world out there. And so fast forward 25 years later, and I became the head of digital product for Sesame Street. And it was a really interesting coming full circle for me, and was enthralled with working with Elmo and thought he was fantastic. And then one day, I got a call about a job at Public Radio International, which I had been involved with journalism and storytelling prior to graduate school. And I said, this is my dream. So I traded in a fuzzy puppet for Carl Castle. But it's kind of all the same thing. I mean, in the end, it's about how do we have people who are compelling in storytelling, and how can we engage them in an interesting conversation. So I think we're at exciting times. We're also in scary times when it comes to media and technology and education, whether we're educating or building knowledge or not, which I can talk to in a little bit. There's some really interesting data on that. And so at PRI, the way that we approach these issues is to think about knowledge and where can we fulfill unmet needs? How can we make a difference? And there are 3 areas where we focus on. We focus on the fact that there is massive spreads of misinformation in society now, so it's not just about informing and putting it out there. It's understanding that there are forces that are pushing information out that is actually incorrect. And in fact, the World Economic Forum does an agenda survey each year of world leaders, and in 2014, the massive spread of misinformation was one of the top 10 challenges facing the world. And so when we think about our work, the other 9 problems, global warming, how we deal with income equality, all kinds of issues, if you don't have the information and you don't have the facts from number 10, it can affect the other 9. And the second piece that we look at is how we can bring more voices into the conversation that aren't there today. There are 6 corporations that control 90% of news product in the United States in terms of what people see and hear and read. We need to have antidotes to that. We need to use technology to help be a counterbalance to that. And finally, there's widespread apathy that comes from disenfranchisement because people don't feel that there's opportunity for them to be part of the solution. And so we're looking at how media and knowledge and action can play a part in how people can change their lives and feel more connected with their communities and build knowledge at the same time.
Yeah, and we're going to get to the responsibility part in a second that I think all 3 of our organizations feel towards trying to play a responsible role in chaperoning and curating this knowledge. It is interesting that you both have a story of learning to program a computer as your kind of curious moment. It was also my curious moment when I was in the 6th grade and they ran out of sort of math curriculum, and if you just took the pretests of the book, since the 6th grade was the last year of elementary school, you just kind of tested out, then you were done, and they would send you to the library. And so myself and a couple of other people were sent to the library on the 3rd day of school, and we were left with nothing to do for the entire year for all of math class, and there happened to be, I assume you guys are working on that problem and that doesn't happen anymore. I hope it doesn't happen anymore. And I was in Wichita, Kansas. And we just had a computer there and we learned, and that was, I remember really touching moment. I just remember so clearly trying to figure out what the heck this computer thing was, and we were using Logo to program, and that's actually how I ended up writing a programming language for kids eventually. And so I wonder if there's sort of something there about as we're entering this technology age and we're trying to take technology into the classroom, that maybe some of the best ways to have curious moments are going to always be outside of that classroom, because that feeling of pioneering discovery has to maybe happen on your own. I mean, maybe happen without the formal confines. So that's just an interesting thought. I want to talk about the responsibility that we feel, though, that Flipboard is doing curation and editorial, and every day you're making decisions, and you have a group of people who are not licensed by the government or anybody else to make those decisions. And PRI, while you are a nonprofit and have sort of FCC regulations and things, and make sure you have your funding, you're also doing editorial and curating. And then there's all kinds of other news organizations that are basically not doing any of that kind of thing, or purposely, as you mentioned, potentially, sort of pushing one side of the agenda. So talk about, Alisa, maybe you first, talk about what do you feel the responsibility is that you have to make sure that your editorial job is being done the right way as you see it? And how does that tie into the organization?
Well, we're a small organization with a fairly large footprint. So PRI itself is 100 people. And we reach about 20 million people each month with our content across radio and digital platforms. And so in addition to covering the news cycle itself, which is something we do across all of our programming and in digital product, we do look at these places where there's unmet content needs or where there's a problem, and trying to figure out why is that happening and what systemic is happening and how can we be a solution. So I can use one example. So it was an observation. There's a really interesting study that comes out every year called Who Makes the News? And it looks at how women are portrayed in media, and specifically news media. And one of the findings from that is that women are seen only 24% of the time featured in any way in the news. So when you consider—
You said 24%
24%
of the time.
In any way. And a majority of that portrayal tends to be stereotypical. So objectification, and in kind of stereotypical roles, victims, et cetera. So when you look at this, and this is across the entire world, this is the 24% is an average across the entire world. And interestingly, the US is the 3rd worst in terms of stereotypical portrayals, behind the Middle East and Africa. So we noted this, and it's not purposeful, I think, but you could look at it and say it's actually mass deception. that we don't actually have an accurate picture of the world because women are literally not present or not reflected, and we all know that women are 50% of the population and doing all kinds of things. So we make decisions in our content to make sure that women are a part of every kind of story. So 56% of PRI's stories feature women in some way, shape, or form, which is what you would expect, in terms of where we are in the population. So it's about choices that we make, not only in the composition of our content, but where we can also go deeper, because specific topics are important that may or may not be covered as much in the news cycle, because maybe it's harder from a P&L standpoint and pure profit standpoint to make the justification of why you would invest in X area or Y area. And we, because we are a social enterprise and we have earned revenue as well as contributed income, we can make different decisions. So we talk a lot about, we have the luxury of choice of where we try to dive deeper, and how can we, not only through our own work, but set an example of growth and showing incredible case studies about when you actually don't ignore women, how you actually grow like crazy. So if you don't want to do it because it's the right thing to do, maybe you'll do it because you'll experience growth because you do it. So that's part of the way that we make decisions and try to approach our work.
And do you actually keep tabs on things like that and try to make sure that you are providing, say, 50% coverage of women?
Yes. So one of the things that we're doing, and within the next number of months, we'll be releasing this, because we've been inspired by parts of what Silicon Valley is doing and trying to address some of these issues. So what happens is we often have numbers in aggregate, but you don't have the numbers down to an individual organizational level. So not only the inputs of who's creating it, but the outputs of what's being created. So we've been thinking a lot about how can we set up environments like that, which then can create incentives for others to do the same thing. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Bechdel test. Mm-hmm. For those of you who don't.
Please tell me.
So what it is it's this woman set Bechdel. I don't actually know her first name, actually. But anyway, it's a test where she says she won't see a movie. Basically, if two women are talking and the only subject they talk about is a man in the movie, she won't see that movie. And what ends up happening is 70% of the movie she can't see, because that's the only way that women are portrayed in the movie. And so we've been thinking a lot about what is the Bechdel test for news. And it's not just about women, it's about various groups that are majority, will be majority, or are majority, particularly when you look at millennials, and how they aren't being reflected. And so it's really about trying to create signals of transparency, so when people are consuming your content, they know what they're getting in aggregate. I'm very interested in that, and there's a lot of opaqueness, actually, in the way the news media is covered, because it's always happening. It's a data problem, how you can actually create seals of approval so that people know, that's what I might be getting there or what I'm not getting there from this particular source.
So Mike, can you share about how Flipboard thinks about this problem, and how much of responsibility you feel that you have for sort of facilitating this learning in a fair and balanced way?
Well, yeah, we, now increasingly people get their news from social media channels. And so they get, in other words, from a lot of their friends, posted on Facebook and things like that. The challenge with that is that the type of things that tend to get shared are the kinds of things that, end up being more link bait. You get completely random content. Facebook is like a slot machine for content. You pull a lever and you never know what you're going to get. And you're going to get some link bait, you're going to get some selfies, you're going to get some diet ads, and it's a challenging environment for news. So what we wanted to try to do was create an experience that was really geared more around you follow your interests. Yes, you can have your friends involved, but primarily you're following your interests, and that's how the content gets to you. Mm-hmm. And then second, rather than having just algorithmic approaches where quantity is valued over quality, we actually have people involved, editors, curators, who are handpicking the news story by story every single day, so that we have really high quality stories from the world's best sources packaged together, and not just the stories that are the best, link baited title or headline. We're looking for really high quality content. And that we try to do across the board, and that's a big responsibility we have to our audience, is to really provide high quality, well-balanced news that is something that's truly informative as opposed to just something that is the most popular.
And if you had to guess what percentage of content consumed on Flipboard would count as sort of this knowledge, valuable information as opposed to fluffier stuff, would you have some way to?
Well, yeah, no, I would say that our audience, by and large, really, they come to Flipboard to get that high quality content. So that's what they're looking for. I mean, it's easy to find all the link bait stuff. Flipboard is a place where you go to really dive deep on things like gun control or climate change or things that you love, like mountain biking or sailing, anything in between. Going to a place that is about the things you're passionate about, that has the best content thoughtfully packaged for that thing is something that, is why people use Flipboard.
And so does that mean that Flipboard also has a place in the classroom? Is there a way to take the Flipboard model and metaphor and actually incorporate it into real classroom learning?
Absolutely. In fact, that's, big reason why I was excited to be part of this discussion today, because teachers use Flipboard to package the best stories for their students, for the curriculum that they're building. For example, for history, if you want to find the best resources, the best stories across the entire internet, package them together in a way that's easy to reach for students who live on their smartphones. And they can all read those stories together in the form of a magazine. It's super easy to do on their smartphone. Then what's really cool is that you can go a step further and you can do something like integrate current events where not only the teacher, but also all of the students can co-contribute stories to a magazine, for example, about economics. And so you can get great stories that the teacher has put in, as well as the students are contributing, here's a really great current events article about something that's going on in economics right now, perhaps having to do with the future of oil and oil prices and how they affect the economy. So that kind of packaging is truly awesome. And what's really great about it is how teachers use Flipboard. If you go to Flip.edu on Flipboard, you can see all the different ways that teachers are using Flipboard to educate themselves and other teachers. So fellow history teachers can share all the best content and links and stories that they have found over the years to teach their students. Teachers can share best practices, technology breakthroughs, new ways to get to kids on smartphones through these magazines that they can curate and read and follow on Flipboard. So it's really actually taken off tremendously. Hundreds of thousands of teachers using Flipboard to reach kids when they're on their smartphones, right? In the kind of environment that they're used to spending time in.
And Alisa, what about public radio? Is there a place for the audio and radio in the classroom in some kind of more formal setting?
Yeah, so obviously public broadcasting more broadly, you have PBS Learning, which provides curriculum and content based on PBS programming for pre-K through 12.
Mostly video-based, I would assume.
Mostly video-based, yeah. Right. With public radio, because our content tends to be a bit more adult, it's really looking at high school and primarily in college. So we find that our audio content is being used a lot in schools. We get lots of solicitations and people who are wanting more of this and how to have kind of lists of what should I understand about Iran, what's the history of the region, various things, just similar to what Mike was talking about. And we've also done things in terms of having our audio content and transcripts available through various systems that are in libraries around the country. So we've looked at it from various forms. In public media, there tends to be a stronger connection and kind of a formal kind of teaching standpoint when it comes to pre-K through 12. But in public media, we do know that a lot of teachers are using our content professors in a university setting and in post-secondary education, in part because it is relevant.
Yeah.
It's content that's based upon what's happening in the news or powerful storytelling as a peg to understand the underlying economic forces or the underlying science behind climate change, or how this particular law can affect this group of people in this kind of way. It creates that real connection to immediacy, which is often one of the most powerful teaching tools.
I mean, it seems like the election cycle that we're currently going through is an obvious example of that, and where almost all of the information you're getting is from the news media. I'd imagine that your newsrooms have been blowing up with interesting discussions about that topic. Can you maybe just chime in a little bit about, what is your perspective on the current election? Are you guys doing special things or trying to make sure that the information is being presented in a certain way during this crazy, crazy time?
Yeah, I think that now is an incredibly important time to make sure that we can bring perspective to what is being said in the election. It's just such extremism right now and polarization. And the problem is that, that's the stuff that gets picked up. Those are the headlines that people click on. And so that just gets propagated. And so you need to, we really think it's important to create an environment that balances that out. And, we want to show the different positions, side by side with each other, from the left, from the right, et cetera, and try to create that broader perspective. The challenging part is that if you let numbers or ratings drive what news programming you do, you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to just add more fuel to the crazy things that are being said right now in the election. And I don't think that's good for anybody. And so I think figuring out a way where, I do think a lot of people luckily want the truth. They want to understand what's the real deal. Creating an environment that gets to that is absolutely crucial.
And what about PRI?
The same. I mean, I think trying to show, one of the things that we're really focused on is facts. Because there's a lot. I know,
it's so boring.
Kind of
Exactly.
crazy. But really trying to get at an underlying powerful story and relating it to a fact. Because the fact is that there is a lot in our discourse right now that isn't actually based on facts in terms of reality. And so the challenge is, in a world where there's so much hyperbole and so many fireworks, is how to cut through. And our approach has been to try not to be covering what everyone else is covering or cover it from the side so that we really look at first and second generation Americans and their experience, and what are the facts about economic development, and what are the facts about climate change, and how through storytelling we can make that connection. We've also really focused in addition to covering what's happening in the broader sense of the millennials, and what is the millennial perspective and the millennial voting bloc in this election as an important arbiter of what the future could hold. It is one of the most economically challenged generations and I think ever, actually, in terms of the disparity. And so what does that mean in terms of the kind of decisions that are made, and why are they attracted in one form or another to certain candidates in an environment like that, I think is a really important conversation for us to have. And finally, this interesting thing about millennials being very interested in what happens in the world, but almost a disconnection between action and voting.
But that seems so boring compared to like nude images of Trump's wife, or talking about the food fights that are happening in the election. Like, how do you resist the candy that's all over the place? That's kind of seems to be just more and more coverage and more coverage. And then there's meta coverage about it, and then it's on your social feeds, and then the social coverage about the coverage. And people, like, how do you resist that urge or try to fight that when that's everywhere?
Well, I think that's the key thing, is you have to know what you are, why people come to you, right? I think people come to PRI or they come to Flipboard because they know they're going to get the real deal. They know they're going to get, that's what they're looking for. And the good news is that there's plenty of people who want that. And as long as you don't give into that temptation of like catering to the link bait and trying to just drive clicks and then then I think you can create an environment that people are going to love. The key also is to create a monetization model that sustains that. So high quality premium advertising, not a bunch of diet ads, but high quality advertising, full page ads in our case from Rolex or Breitling or Gucci, things that are aspirational, they're beautiful, and they're much more valuable. We have a lot fewer advertisers on Flipboard. It's really more about class than mass, and that ends up being a lot more valuable and creates a much more sustainable environment for this really high quality content to thrive and to continue to be subsidized.
Right. And Alisa, maybe you can close this out, because to me it seems like you have to resist. You told me earlier that there's this like candy in the candy store, and it's impossible at some point to keep the kids from going for the candy in the candy store. So how do you keep from putting, like, you have a business model you have to live up to, you have to try to be profitable, and you have to also build an audience. How do you resist that temptation to put out the candy, and what can we as a collective audience who is consuming this media, what can we do to kind of help keep the media from keep dangling this candy that's so bad for us?
Stuff. Well, I would say, first of all, using curation platforms or curation in your own experience is super important, because it's important to have multiple sources and multiple perspectives. Obviously, Flipboard does that. Understand that through your social media feeds, you're not always getting that, in part because of the way the algorithm works, right? So not understanding what you're not seeing as a part of what you're consuming. Listen, I use Facebook, I use Twitter, I use all the social feeds as well, but I also there's a certain point where you have to say to yourself, am I actually seeing the full picture here, as a part of that loop? Interesting book by Eli Praiser about the filter bubble. And it's really about this idea of how we have to take personal responsibility for the mix of content that we create. And then obviously at PRI, we work to try to be interesting and engaging. We're not trying to be broccoli, I like to sort of broccoli with, cheddar cheese on top or something. So it's really about trying to fight that fight. And the fact of the matter is you can be interested in Kim Kardashian, and you might also be highly interested in how you're going to get a great job and be able to support your family, right? You can be in those two worlds at the same time. At least that's what we found as people consume our content and as we grow, particularly digitally, as well as what we see in the public radio audience.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining us. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you all for hanging out with us.